Hey everyone, if you don't recognize this voice, it's because I'm from the General Knowledge channel. I'm doing this video in collaboration with Knowledgia. I hope I'm saying the name right. I did the first part for his channel and he did the second part on mine. Today, we're going to be talking about the American Civil War. Now, the Civil War is long and complicated to explain, so for this first part, I'm going to divide it into three topics. 1. What the causes of secession were. 2. The outbreak of the war. And 3. The first part of the war itself. So let's get to it. The first cause of secession and of the war that jumps into everyone's mind is slavery. The main point was that the Northerners thought that the idea of a republic was incompatible with a society where slavery existed, so they created a strategy to slowly stop slavery until it became gradually extinct. The Southern states criticized this strategy, stating that it was infringing upon their constitutional rights. They had the opinion that ending slavery would put their economy in trouble due to its high dependence on unpaid labor and the investment that they had made in buying said slaves. We can relate this to the fact that the North was more industrial than the mostly rural and agricultural South. There was also the issue of racism and the fear that some people had of integrating African Americans into society as their equals. Another issue at hand was the territorial crisis. With the addition of new territories to the Union, there was an important question to be answered. Would these new states be pro or anti-slavery? They tried equally distributing them, but some caused a collision of forces on each side, like Mississippi. In the meantime, there was a big argument over who could outlaw slavery. If the central government, if local populations, if state governors. Lincoln, for instance, proposed a doctrine which stated that Congress could outlaw slavery but never again allow it. There was also the issue of disagreement over certain policies, like tariffs. Southerners wanted less tariffs and free trade for their plantations, while the Northern industrials were supporting of more tariffs and protectionism of the American industry. In the midst of all these disagreements over new territories, new policies, and more, the Southern states began arguing that they had the right to secede from the Union, while the North claimed that the point of the Union was a perpetual gathering of all regions. More and more tension began to grow between the North and the South. And while Northerners were dedicated to the idea of national unity, Southerners saw their requests ignored and their principles refused. And they saw this as an offense to their honor, which contributed to the rise of Southern nationalism, not for the US as a whole, but for the Southern territory alone. And then came the final trigger, if you will. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. The slave states also became a minority in the House, and now feared that Lincoln would stop the expansion of slavery and put it on a course of extinction. So, even before Lincoln took office, 7 of the slave states had already declared secession from the Republic and joined together to form the Confederacy. The fuse of war was lit, and it would soon blow up in flames. Now let's look at the second topic, the outbreak of the war. With Lincoln's election and the secession of slave states from the Union, all conditions were created for the war to begin. There was a brief attempt to prevent the secession. The Crittenden Compromise proposed a constitutional ban on slavery in the North, allowing it in the South, but Lincoln and his Republican Party refused it. There was a more moderate proposal from the Republicans, not condoning slavery, but not interfering where it already existed. But this time, the South refused. South Carolina kicked things off, and soon the states known as the Cotton States followed its example. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Their main excuse for secession was that the North was not doing its part of the Fugitive Act. This act stated that any state, even in the North, who caught a fugitive slave should return it to its owner. Northern states were against slavery, and so they didn't do this. But since it was an agreement, Southern states said that technically it was the North who was in the wrong, and they seceded. Southern senators and congressmen abandoned the House and formed a new federal government as the Confederate States of America. To sum it up, a list of policies, including and mostly revolving around slavery, caused tension between the North and the South, and this tension culminated in secession, which eventually led to the Civil War. Local forces in the South took hold of federal buildings and military forts. When Lincoln took office, he stated that the US would make no move to retake these places, and if their functioning was impossible, then there would be no federal services in those areas. The South sent delegations to Washington, D.C. to try and enter a peace treaty, offering to pay for the federal lands that they had occupied. But the North didn't recognize their independence and legitimacy as a government, so they refused to negotiate. A few forts remained under Union control in the South, and Lincoln ordered them not to surrender, but only fire when fired upon. And this is where the flame of war is lit, and the US Civil War effectively begins, with the Battle of Fort Sumter in Charleston, North Carolina. The South demanded the surrender of the fort, but they refused and were then bombarded and forced to capitulate. This rallied the North to the defense of American nationalism and to the defense of the Union. But the North underestimated Southern support for secession, thinking that the majority of Southern people would be in favor of the Union, and also underestimated the support of some border states. Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina refused Lincoln's call to arms against their neighbors, and seceded as well to join the Confederacy. Virginia was even rewarded for its support of the South, who chose Richmond as the new capital of the Confederacy. In this map, we can see how the border states behaved during the war. Even those border states which remained in the Union had the exception of permitting slavery. Some of them were against the end of slavery, but were not in support of secession, so they sided with the Union. Maryland is a very interesting case because it surrounded the northern capital of Washington, D.C., but it was a slave state. It didn't want to leave the Union, but it rejected attacks on the South and didn't want to be used as the pathway for northern troops. In response, Lincoln imposed martial law and took control of the state. Some tried to maintain neutrality, like Kentucky, but sided with the Union when they were invaded by the Confederate troops. And in all this mess, a new state was born, West Virginia, who declared itself a state, seceding itself from Virginia, who had seceded itself from the US. At this point, it's fair to say that we are in a full-blown civil war. So, on to the third topic, the war itself. The American Civil War is one of the bloodiest civil wars history has ever seen. In only 4 years, there were 237 battles, with high numbers of casualties. When the first 7 states seceded, the US had a very small army of only about 16,000 men. The Confederacy decided to form a new army of 100,000, and so the Union responded equally. Between volunteers and drafted soldiers, thousands took arms both in the North and the South, fighting in full-blown battles or small skirmishes, brothers versus brothers. The war wasn't fought on land alone. Sea warfare also took an important role in the war, especially because it happened midst Industrial Revolution, and new boats like steamers could be tested in the war. The North, for instance, had a strategy called the Anaconda Plan to blockade the entire coast of the Confederacy using the Mississippi River. This had the aim of stopping the South from importing and exporting goods and crumbled their economy. The success of the plan itself is debatable, but whether because of it or not, the South's economy did suffer immensely during the war. Some say that the percentage of ships which were effectively blocked was too low, only about 1/4. But others argue that the measure of the blockade's success was not the few ships that slipped through, but the thousands that never tried it, leaving the South with few supplies. On the other side, the Confederacy bought ships from Britain and converted them to warships and also attacked. After the war, the US demanded compensation from the English, who paid them $15 million. And this brings us to an interesting point of the war: diplomacy. The South hoped that Britain and France would join them, and when they didn't, they tried to use them as mediators. But the North stopped it by threatening war to any country which recognized the independence of the Confederacy. The South responded by blockading Europe's cotton supply in hopes that they would join the war to get their cotton, but that didn't happen, and Europe just found other sources for it. Simultaneously, most of European governments, at this time still formed by the elite and most of their monarchies, viewed the American Civil War with disdain, and as the proof that republicanism was doomed to fail. So, despite not being involved, a lot of them seem to have kind of wanted the Confederacy to be successful. So to sum it up, Britain was neutral, but at times did some things which the Union wasn't too happy with. France did the same, because they wanted Confederate support to colonize Mexico. Mexico itself was also neutral, but some Mexican warlords near the border collaborated with the Confederate States. Russia was the only powerful nation to offer assistance to the Union, at least verbally. The Russian Navy sent 2 fleets to American waters, just in case Britain and France joined the war against the US. But let's get back to the war itself. As for the actual battles, they mostly took place on the East Coast, which is divided between the East and the West theater amongst a few small other ones. Confederates wore gray, and Northerners wore blue. In the Eastern Theater, the main Confederate force was the Army of Northern Virginia, from which the Confederate flag emerged. Its commander was the famous Robert E. Lee. Other famous battles took place in this theater, like the battles of 1st and 2nd Bull Run, the Battle of Antietam, the Confederacy's first invasion of the North, where Robert E. Lee led over 45,000 men into Maryland, provoking the deadliest one-day battle in the war, ending in a technical Southern defeat since their invasion of the North was halted, and many other battles, like Fredericksburg, where over 12,000 Union soldiers died, Chancellorsville, where General Lee performed a risky strategy of dividing its troops in half while being outnumbered 2-1, achieving a tremendous victory for the South, and Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle of the war, and what many see as its turning point, destroying many of the South's chances for victory with the death of 28,000 of its soldiers. Despite this grand victory, it's said that Lincoln was upset at his generals because they couldn't stop General Lee from escaping. And this was the war up to this point in the Eastern Theater. Next, we move to the West Theater and to the final parts of the American Civil War as well as its aftermath. But that's in the video which Knowledgia did on my channel. So if you want to keep watching and learn about the second half of the war, make sure to check that out. Thanks to Knowledgia for being up to collaborate on these videos. He has great content, so make sure to subscribe to his channel if you haven't yet, and hopefully I will see you on my channel for part 2 of this video.